All right, we've been talking about this forensics copies here, making these copies, making sure that we have two of them. How do we make them? You can't just do a file copy. It doesn't work. What we want to do is we want to say, hey, we've got spinning platters here. We want to do a bit by bit copy of those platters to another device. So take the original media, make a copy of it. It can create an exact disk image of the first. Now you can pull that to a secondary drive, or in cases where you use guidance software like EnCase, you can actually pull it to a compressed file. So you may be able to get away with bit for bit imaging pulled to a compressed file to get it onto a smaller drive. I say, look, drive space is so cheap these days, just get another drive. Before you do that imaging of that, make sure that your reference disk that you're using has been cleaned sufficiently at a forensic level. Usually I call this a Gutman overwrite, or you'll talk about the DoD specification on this that tells you about the overwriting. We'll get to the specifications later on. But what it really boils down to is that we zero out that disk and we write to that drive a set of zeros, a set of ones, a set of nines, and then a set of zeros again to say, okay, now there is sufficient evidence here in this process. There are actually, in your more sophisticated disk duplicators, you can actually plug in your reference drives and get that tool to zero out that particular drive and go ahead and print you a ticket for it saying on this date at this time it was zeroed out physically. So we can do that. Do not make the mistake of trying to degauss your disk. That's actually passing a magnet over top of that disk that will actually wreck the drive. So that won't work. You want a wiper at this point, because then you're also going to use a physical disk duplication at a bit for bit level. You want the errors. You want the slack space. You want all of those extra pieces in there because you're doing this at a physical level. And you say, well, Dean, is there something besides a physical level? Yes, there is. There's a logical level. The extraction is based upon the file system. The slack is, notice in red, not included. In the physical extraction, we're looking at the partition structure, and the file slack is included. This works great for spinning platters, not so much for solid-state drives. Okay, now, here's the thing. If we look at this, say, well, Dean, if physical extraction is the way to go, why not just always do that? Well, there are problems and there are situations where we may not have the time. So we have to prioritize the evidence at this point. And we look at it and say, okay, we've got 20 drives here. We've got 2,000 CDs here. How are we going to prioritize this? What are we going to look at and review at this moment in time? And we're going to say how we're going to document this evidence and establish that this evidence is in our custody. Also remember that when you're dealing with this evidence, when you pick up that hard drive, that it is susceptible to electromagnetic interference, and you need to protect it as if it was gold at that point, and not allow any demagnetizers or degaussers to be near it, or any kind of magnetic media that could possibly destroy the bits on it. So there are plenty of evidence cases that protect against this very thing. If you need continuous power, remember, if we have that desktop unit in somebody's house, we can actually snip the wires on the back end and reconnect it to another power source, or not reconnect it, but continue to provide power for it through a UPS or battery backup and actually get that off site. The best thing, by the way, there is, if it's not an all-in-one unit, is to not supply power to the actual monitor and supply it to the actual tower, if you will, in most cases. Okay, now we need to talk about acquire and analyze here. We're going to go over this lightly, and we're going to come back to it and realize that we're digging into our evidence much deeper in later chapters. But I want to give you a feel for it for completeness sake here. So acquire and analyze, the time frame, the data hiding, and the analysis of the extracted data. Time frame analysis. When and in what order did these things occur? You should be recording that as you go along. Data hiding analysis. Our adversary wants to protect their resources at this point. Do they have a password on their system? Have they used steganography? Have they encrypted it? Have they compressed their files with a password on it? Today, with TrueCrypt volumes, you can not only have a TrueCrypt volume, but you can also have a hidden volume inside of that. So it may be that our adversary, if they have the TrueCrypt installed on the local machine, and you look down and you go, look, there's TrueCrypt there. There's these different kinds of software on this particular machine that can give you a clue as to how sophisticated they are in their data hiding, and you're to do that analysis at the scene. Now, when you're extracting the data, remember you're using data used to find a particular data. Okay, so you'll say, in the warrant, we are looking for this particular criminal activity or these particular things. So this is my initial search for this particular element, this particular name of set or data. Now this may be done on scene, or this may be done back at your forensics laboratory, but you have to say, what are you looking for as far as data names are concerned? What are the characteristics of this data? Is it pictures? Is it images? Is it spreadsheets? Is it QuickBooks files? And you have to figure out and do a lot of analysis at that point and make some choices. The data used for finding information. So you might look at directory structures, file attributes, names, date and timestamps, file sizes, and location. Let's just zero in for a moment to date and timestamps. If you know the illegal activity that you were trying to prove occurred between this date and this date, maybe you take a sample of the information and say, okay, I'm looking for all of the transactions that occurred at this particular time or around these time areas. Look for all the files that have been changed in that particular time, and then you may prioritize and say, I'm going to look through this evidence here before I get to the other stuff. So that data used in finding information, that usually comes from your warrant that you have. Remember, when you're looking at the characteristics of data, time framing, data hiding, application and file, ownership and possession, all give you indicators of what your next step is actually going to be in your analysis. You also may have to go back and get that service request. You may have to refresh yourself in a lot of cases, figuring out what your legal authority is for the searches and what they were seeking out. You're going to have to also track down investigative leads. Sometimes you aren't there and somebody walks up to you and says, here's the phone, go ahead and figure it out. Find out what's on this, and here's the warrant that goes along with this. And you may look on there and you may say, oh, well, this gets plugged in, and the last time that this was synced was 2 days ago, and it was synced with a Macintosh computer because that's the only one that this will sync with. You may turn around and say, hey, go get another warrant and look for the Macintosh computer because there's no data on this, but it was synced back to something else before it was actually cleared. You may get an extended warrant that in that case to go back and collect more data. Hopefully they got it all up front. Sometimes that's not the case. So that's a little bit of what's going on for the analysis that we're going to do, analysis and acquirement, but we'll dig down into this later on.